Welcome to Unit 6, Revival and Reform, Section 1, A Religious Awakening. In this section, we're going to be talking about the Second Great Awakening, a time period in the United States where religious excitement and energy was huge. In order for there to be a Second Great Awakening, that implies that there was a first, and there was. First Great Awakening was before the Revolutionary War. Benjamin Franklin would have been an early young man at this time period, starting out his business in printing and going around Philadelphia and figuring out kind of his life. And he was impressed with a lot of the preachers during the First Great Awakening. It was also a time of great religious excitement. The First Great Awakening sparked and helped spark the Revolutionary War, though. A lot of religion and a lot of ideas were coming about personal liberty and what God gave us as rights. And a lot of our great founding fathers will come from this time period. They'll have come from this excitement. Where the Second Great Awakening, the one we're going to be talking about, is going to be more of a reform movement. It's going to be a movement talking a lot more about, yes, religion, but reforming society, trying to make society better, and making sure that your salvation is good, that you're going to go to heaven and not going to go to hell. That's going to be kind of the more main focus of the Second Great Awakening. And it will have tremendous impact on government as well as cultural society. And some groups will be a little bit more successful than others, and we'll be talking about a lot of that. So we'll be talking about this is kind of the early 19th century. So we're talking about the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and going on into that time period. Our objectives are as follows. Our focus question for this unit is, what is the best way to try and reform society? There are hundreds and thousands of factions or groups, political parties, reform movements out there. Think about today. Think about all the movements that you see on TV, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Antifa, or it be the Tea Party or any group. All these groups have one thing in common. They're trying to change society based on the viewpoints that they have. Well, what's the best way? Some of these groups are more successful than others. What do they do that makes them successful versus other groups? What do they do that makes them largely not successful? We look at the Westboro Baptist Church. They go to funerals of servicemen who have died in action and stand there with signs telling them, the parents and everyone else, that their sons or daughters are burning in hell, etc. They're not very successful, and it's pretty obvious why. So what do these other groups, though, do that make them more successful than other groups? So that's going to be our focus question. What do we try to do? If you want to reform society, what should you do? Objective 1, how did preachers get trained? Preachers are going to have a very specific way of actually becoming a preacher, and it's going to be a lucrative business at this time period. Lots of people will join their churches and will support those people. It'll be very, very exciting to become a preacher at this time. Objective 2, what problems existed between religion and government at this time? In the United States, we've always had difficulty with religion and government. And it makes sense. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just this discussion of, where does religion end and government begin, and vice versa. Where does government begin and religion end? And so we'll be talking about what problems existed at this time. And then objective 3, what are the different faiths that formed at this time? There will be some major faiths, some that you'll even identify with today, that come out of this movement. Objective 4, what groups face persecution because of their faiths? Multiple groups are going to face severe persecution at this time period. Then objective 5, what groups were not religious but still were reform movements? So it's not completely religious just here. We're going to be talking about some other groups and their utopian ideas of how they can create a perfect society, which sometimes will center on God, but other times will have nothing to do with God. So the Second Great Awakening is, like I said, after the Revolutionary War. The first one, the Great Awakening, was before, and it made people excited and inspired them to form the United States. Versus, again, the Second Great Awakening is going to be head up by a lot of preachers, and it's going to be all about reforming or reviving the church. So these preachers were known as revivalists. Now think about that word for a second. Revivalists. What other word can you get from that? Revive, right? And so that's what this is implying, is that something's happened to Christianity up to this point. It's kind of at a low key. It's dying. So we need to revive it. We need to bring it back, get it exciting again, get people active again. And so these revivalists would try to revive the religion, and they would try to make the United States moral in the sight of God. There's a lot of drinking at this time. A lot of this will be fueled by trying to stop the consumption or the major consumption of alcohol. They're also going to create these social reforms and try to have membership in their churches skyrocket. Everybody will join some kind of a church, and if you're not a part of my church, then you really aren't a good person. It's going to be kind of the viewpoint of this time period. So if you look at this picture here for a second, you can see this is a picture of what a common revival would have been like. Okay, so look at it for a second here. Number one, you can see that it's outside. A lot of these revivals were outside. They were not necessarily in buildings. Now, that does not mean that there were not church buildings. There were tons of church buildings being built. But a lot of times people went outside as they could get more excited. They could connect with nature, all sorts of things. They could have huge groups. They could travel around. You could see tents being formed, set up. People might stay for, sometimes these could be days, these revivals. Could be 3 or 4 days at a time. Here you have this loose leaf structure here that's made preacher standing here, and look at how he's standing. He's not behind a pulpit. He's not being calm and collected. He is fiercely preaching something. His hands up, or he's got something in it. Maybe it's the Bible or a sermon or something like that. He's leaning forward. He's talking, and here you have other people, presumably other preachers in the background that are waiting. And if you look at the audience, we have a huge audience, and they're all laying or sitting on benches. And you might think that these people are just like rude and ridiculous for laying here, but it could be a couple things. Number one, they're probably being moved upon by the Spirit. Some might be talking in tongues. Others might be translating what they're saying. But these people are outside and are excited about the religious movement. And a lot of these revivals were. If you've ever been to a revival, you know what I'm talking about. It can get pretty exciting at times. So let's start talking a little bit about these camp meetings and where they started and where they went. So really, we see the most of them started in Kentucky. Something about Kentucky, I think it's just a good central location for a lot of the northeastern states. And people pushed up northeast there and throughout the South and the Midwest as well. But Kentucky's going to be a hot center for this religious revival. And again, these could sometimes go a week at a time. Now, the people that did these revivals were called evangelicals. Now, we use that term today a little bit, and that's even a movement. Evangelical church today is more or less a non-denominational church. It's more about just accepting Jesus Christ, confessing your sins to him, and accepting his gift of salvation. That's more what evangelical means today. Evangelical actually means to preach, to evangelize the message of Jesus Christ. So an evangelical is somebody who was going to preach about Jesus. And they could elicit some very strong emotions. I've met a lot of evangelicals. I lived in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, for quite some time. And in this area, there is huge churches. I mean, just ginormous. You get congregations of 8,000 people. It'd be like football stadiums. And I remember one time in Tulsa, there was a church, it was called Guts. And I thought that was crazy. I was like, Guts? Why is a church called Guts? And so when I finally met somebody that belonged to the church, I said, why is your church called Guts? And I loved their response. Their response was, because it takes guts to stand up for Jesus. And these people were very, very excited, and they would elicit strong emotions. I went to another church one time, and inside it had a track, which I thought was really, really interesting. But the track wasn't like separate from the congregation. You know, like a lot of churches, you'll see like a basketball court or something like that is near the chapel or something. This was not like that. This was around the chapel. And I asked why they had a track that way. And they said, because during our services, when people get excited, they'll go up and they'll do laps for Jesus. They'll go run around and do laps for Jesus. And so I'm not making fun of these groups at all. This is just, I mean, I love these people and it was great. But again, it elicited strong emotions from people. And this could attract different converts. There was all sorts of things. I remember in Tulsa as well, there was a church called I think it was Church 360 or 180 or something like that. And they attracted a lot of young people. Why? They had all sorts of things. Movie theater, bowling alley in their church. Kids would go and have like huge game nights on the movie theater screen that they had. And these people were trying to attract these younger kids and doing things that interested them so that way they could be connected to Christ. And so these people, they attracted their different converts. They would tailor their message for these converts specifically. And one of these examples of an evangelical at this time, that an evangelist, would have been Charles Grandison Finney. And Charles Grandison Finney, I pick him just because he was just so powerful in his sermons. People talked about him having a voice of thunder when he spoke. And he really became very fiery in his sermons, and people really were attracted to the way he preached. We have other people like Lyman Beecher, who went to Yale, and in 1832 actually became the president of Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. So into our first objective, how did they become preachers or revivalists? They actually went to school. We'll see that there are groups today. You can go to universities and actually get a theology degree. And these can range. There are sometimes theology degrees that are meant to prepare you to become a preacher, to go preach in a Sunday service. And then there's also theology degrees that are more research history based. So you're going to go research and analyze and look and understand religion from more of a historical standpoint, not from really a preaching standpoint. They believed that what they were doing was ushering in people into what they called the millennium. Now, if you're not familiar with the millennium or this idea, the idea is that one day Jesus Christ is going to come back. He came, he set up a church, he died, was crucified, resurrected, and promised he'd come back one day. And for Christians, if you believe in the millennium at least, what this means is that one day Jesus Christ is going to come back and he's going to rule the earth for 1,000 years. And in that 1,000 years, Satan will be bound and the people will be able to be completely, almost perfect. They'll be living harmoniously. It'll be great. Okay. But before the millennium, there will be lots of crazy things. There'll be famines. There'll be, there'll be pandemics. There'll be wars. There'll be all sorts of things. And so these guys believed that they were really ushering in, and not in some distant future, but soon, they're ushering in the millennium, that Jesus was coming back very soon. Now, a lot of them didn't say like this year, or in 5 years, or 10 years, but most of them from their messages, it seemed like they were really believing that this would be coming within their lifetime or shortly after. So early on, we start to see this separation of church and state. That term actually is not found in the Constitution at all. If you look at the Constitution, it says nothing about church and state, those actual words. Now, in the First Amendment, it does have what's called the Establishment Clause, which means that there can be no established religion, okay? And there also can't be, the government cannot tell you what you can worship or how you can worship. They can't establish a church, okay? There's also the Free and Exercise Clause, which allows you to freely believe what you want and exercise that belief however you want as well. But the idea of separation of church and state actually comes from Thomas Jefferson in a letter that he wrote to a Baptist congregation. And he was just basically saying is that religion is such a hot topic, it's such a controversial topic, that there really ought to be a separation. That government really shouldn't be involved with religion, and religion shouldn't be involved with government. And this makes total sense if you're Thomas Jefferson and the early founding fathers. Why? Because you just came from a country, England, that had for decades and actually really, dozens and dozens of years been fighting over Catholicism and Anglicanism, or the Church of England. They'd been fighting back and forth. And so the idea of not having a set church was very appeasing to the U.S. But don't get the wrong idea. This doesn't mean that they didn't believe that religion should be very interconnected to their daily lives. I think that the way we view separation of church and state would have been really abhorrent to a lot of people. Now, not all. I think Thomas Jefferson would have been very happy with our separation, but many of our founding fathers couldn't even fathom the idea of not having prayer in school or something like that. So these Sabbatarians is a great example of this separation. Okay, Sabbatarians wanted the federal government, the central government in Washington D.C., to recognize what they called the Lord's Day. Now, you might, today look at the Lord's Day, and that would be a Sunday, right? It's the Sabbath day, and they wanted the federal government to recognize that. Now, not that long ago, when I was a kid, I actually do remember most businesses being shut down. But since I've grown up, it seems like almost everywhere is open. Okay. Now, Congress said they didn't have the authority to do this because it would interfere with trade, and they would not ban commerce. They're not going to get in the middle of trade because of some group's religious beliefs. And I think this makes a lot of sense. You think about it. The First Amendment says no establishment of a religion. It's called the Establishment Clause. You cannot establish a religion. Well, if you make Sunday the Sabbath day and you say that nobody can do business on that day, well, what happens when you meet Seventh-day Adventists who believe that the Sabbath day is not in fact Sunday, but it's on a Saturday? Or some Jews who believe that Friday evening through Saturday is the Sabbath day? Or Muslims who just completely don't really have a Sabbath day but would worship more on a Friday? What do you do, right? You can't. This is the problem. And this is what's so great about the United States is we recognize that there are thousands of beliefs out there, and it's impossible to respect as far as the government favoring any of those beliefs. It's impossible, and it wouldn't be good, because if they favor one, they're going to be hurting another. And so this idea is not anti-religion, it's just an acceptance that really we can't please everyone. So Congress had no authority, they said it is. Now, you think about it today. There are so many issues with church and state. So, for instance, no school prayer. That means that we at school cannot say, hey, let's get together and let's say a prayer today. That's why at graduation, when we plan graduation and stuff, you'll notice the teachers say nothing about that. The administration says nothing about prayer. Now, if the students want to do a prayer, we can't really stop them. Or if you as an individual want to pray, we can't really stop you from doing that. Okay? But we cannot try to start prayer. We cannot ask for somebody to pray. And the reason being is and again, a lot of people get really upset about this. And it makes sense. I understand, because they're religiously really devout. But a lot of people get upset about this and they say, we're taking God out of school. But I think what's important is to look at this. You have to be in school by law. Literally, if you do not go to school, the cops, even if your parents say we don't care if they don't go to school, the cops can be called and they can actually take you to juvenile detention. And actually you can get into legal trouble by not attending school. You have to be there. Now, if the government is forcing you to be somewhere by penalty of jail, but then at the same time they're also going to have a prayer, you don't really have a choice if you hear that prayer or don't hear that prayer, right? You have to hear it. And so the idea is not that it's anti-religion or that it's anti-prayer even, but it's an acceptance that because you are being forced to go to school, and there are numerous beliefs at school, we're not going to put any belief in front of another and make it something that people have to endure. And so that's why there's a separation, okay? Now, one of the early groups that's going to really embrace this Second Great Awakening is going to be called the AME. It's an organization that still exists today. It's the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, this is a really interesting church. They made the news a lot lately with some of their civil rights issues and coming together. And the AME Church formed in 1816 as a way for Africans, former slaves, or even current slaves, to meet together under the Methodist umbrella. Methodism is a specific religion. It's like Baptist or LDS or Jehovah's Witness or any faith like that. It's a specific church. And the African Methodist Episcopal Church was created by a former slave named Richard Allen. And they created this church for these slaves so that they have a place that they could unite and be bound or bonded with. Okay. By 1826, so 6 or 10 years later, the membership was already at 8,000 people. And a lot of the great music that we get from the slave spirituals, songs that we have about hope and redemption, and Moses on the Mount, and um, go tell it on the mount, right, and down to the river to pray, and old time religion. A lot of these come from this time period of slave spirituals when slaves were intertwining messages from the Bible to help them in their story. It makes total sense, right? When you listen to slaves singing about Moses, you understand why they connect so much with the book of Exodus and Moses. Moses, a Jew, and the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, doing forced labor, and God promised them that one day they would be saved. If you're a slave, think about that. Think about how powerful that message is, that somebody would come one day and save you, right? That is a huge and hope-inspiring message. And it was also a place where people were treated equally. They were not, because they were African, worried about being taught that they were a lower race or a lower group of people. And so the AME church was a very powerful, and is to this day, a very powerful church. Other faiths that were created was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes known as the Mormons. A man named Joseph Smith, who I think his story demonstrates perfectly this religious excitement going on at the time. Remember, all these revivals are going on, and when he's a little boy, or a teenager, I should say, he's going to these meetings. His family is split. His mother is Presbyterian. His father is kind of a Methodist, but more stay at home, do worship at his house kind of a thing, doesn't really join any of the faiths. And Joseph Smith is going to be really torn. He's going to be told he has to be joining one of these churches. His salvation is that way. And this is very fire brimstone time period. If you don't join our church, you will burn in hell for eternity, is the viewpoint. And so at 14, he will go and he will pray in some woods to ask God what he should do, what church he should join. And in his recount, he's going to say that actually God showed up, appeared to it before him, right here, and then actually introduced his son, Jesus Christ, and told Joseph Smith that, one, he should not join any church, that these churches were trying to revive something that was dead, and that Joseph Smith would not be reviving anything, but he would be restoring something. We call this the Restoration Movement. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not the only restoration movement out there. There are many denominations that preach of restoration. Now, understand the two different terms here. Reviving means to bring something back from the dead, right? To revive it. Where restoration means to restore it or bring it to the way it used to be. So in Joseph Smith's mind and in Latter-day Saint minds, their church is not a new church that formed in the 1800s, but it's a continuation of a church from the original one that Jesus Christ created in the 1st century AD. And so they're going to say, we have these things like Jesus Christ had. And the reason this church is brought up now is they really are probably the most successful church, definitely one of the most successful churches from this movement. Their membership is still large. They have around 16 million members. And it's grown really, really, really quickly. One of the big contentions that we'll talk about, though, is that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the idea of God and Jesus Christ being split is going to be completely contrary to what most Protestants then and today believe. So we'll be talking about that here in a second. But he decides not to join any church, as it said that God told him, and he'll form his own church and restore it, or say he restores it back to the way that Jesus Christ had made it once before. And he says he's going to be commanded to build these churches, and he's going to also build temples. In fact, the LDS Church will actually not have a church building first. They'll actually have built a temple, the Kirtland Temple, before they ever build a building ever to meet in, which is really interesting. This idea of temples is a very central thing to Latter-day Saints. However, probably the most awe-inspiring thing that you could say that Joseph Smith did is translate a book. It's called the Book of Mormon. Now, members of the LDS Church, they believe in the Bible just like any other Christian does. But they believe also that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God. So think of it this way. The Bible is the Word of God in Jerusalem, where the Book of Mormon is the Word of God in the Americas. Bible's talking about people in Jerusalem living there, Jesus talking to them, working with them, setting up a church. And then the Book of Mormon talks about the people in the Americas, the people living there and them starting up a church and Jesus Christ visiting them. And this is why Mormons believe in both of these books. And it's where they actually get their name Mormon from. Because they believe in both these churches. And they're not going to be the only ones to have special new scripture that's going to come from this time period, okay? And like I said, it's probably one of the most successful groups simply because of their membership and their continuous rise. Although there is some evidence that says that their membership is starting to decline a little bit or go at least a little bit more stagnant. It's not growing as fast as it used to. So what are we talking about here? And I think it's really important that we understand some basic concepts. Concepts called the Trinity, the Unitarians, and the Godhead. So the idea of the Trinity is that there is this substance, this idea called God. And from God is a person, God the Father, another person named God the Son, or Jesus Christ, and then God the Holy Ghost. They are all absorbed in this idea of God. But they all three are individual people. Does that make sense? So you have God the Father, who is a God and is unified in that belief. And then you have God the Son, who also is God, and his job was different than God the Father. And then you have God the Holy Spirit, which is different than both of the other two. But they're all God, and they're all wrapped up into this idea of God. That's the Trinity. And probably 85-90% of Christians believe in this viewpoint. Now, Unitarians actually teach that there is one being named God, and that Jesus Christ actually is not God, that he was the Son of God, and that he was not actually divine. Christians believe that salvation is done through Jesus Christ, and that's the only way you can be saved, where Unitarians are going to believe that Jesus Christ was a very good person, a very good man, but definitely not God and not divine. Salvation's not through him. That's called a Unitarian, okay? And they believe that God himself is just one person. And then there's the Godhead, and there's only a few churches that believe in the Godhead. We've got the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we've got Jehovah's Witnesses, and just a few others. And their belief is that you have God the Father. He is the Father. He is actually the only God. And then you have this person named Jesus Christ who is the Son of God, and salvation is done through him. You can't get to God without going through his Son, Jesus Christ. But they're completely two different people. They are not the same person at all. And then you have the Holy Spirit, who again is a completely different person and has a totally different job. And this is called the Godhead. And these three different beliefs are wrapped up into this idea of that. Okay. Now, you might be asking, from what we just talked about, how is it okay that we talk about this stuff in history, but we have a separation of church and state? And the simple message is this: it is impossible to talk about history without talking about religion. But what's important is that we don't focus on a religion and that we don't promote a religion. And that's why we're talking about many religions. But it's helpful for us to understand these viewpoints today and where they're coming from. So this group called the Unitarians, they're going to be a very liberal group. And they're going to say, we are tired of these creeds. Now, when we say creeds, what we're talking about here is an early Christianity. The first couple hundred years, 400 or 500 years after Christ's, and even longer past that, but after Christ's life and death, many of Christians are going to get together and they're going to have creeds. There's going to be the Nicene Creed, which is probably the most famous. There'll be the Apollinarian Creed. There'll be many, many creeds. And in these creeds, they're going to be talking about viewpoints and trying to decide what exactly is the church's position religiously on this. The Unitarians don't have much time for that. They don't really like these creeds. They think that it's limiting, that it's not really super important and that God really doesn't care about those things. And again, they don't believe that Jesus is really God. He's just the Son of God and a really, really cool guy. So the question that we have here is, are these Protestants? What is a Protestant exactly? Because we say that term a lot, and I don't think a lot of students really understand it. So a Protestant is anybody that is in protest of the Catholic Church. So you had originally the Catholic Church. You had like early Christianity church, you had the Catholic Church, and then from that you're going to have thousands and thousands of split-offs. And really it's going to start with Martin Luther. We'll have other groups like Henry VIII and many others that are going to split off from the Church of or the Catholic Church and form their own. Martin Luther will form the Lutheran Church. Charles Wesley will form the Methodist Church. Henry VIII will create the Anglican Church, and from that we'll get more. We'll have eventually Baptists, and we'll have all sorts of Pentecostals, Episcopalians, all sorts of different religions that come from this. And the question then is like, so what is a Protestant and what isn't? And one thing I think is really important is that we understand this term, what they're talking about. So technically, anybody that is a Christian that is not Catholic is, in fact, a Protestant. So in that category, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Baptists, Methodists, any church that's not Catholic is Protestant. However, you will find that some Protestants don't really like to accept, and it makes sense, they don't really like to accept Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses within that idea of Christianity. And the reason being is that a couple things. Number one, Mormons were really weird at this time period. They were doing things that was really, really weird for people. That's number one. And number two, it comes back to this idea of like these creeds again. You had 85-90% of all Christians accepting what's called the Nicene Creed, which accepted the Trinity as doctrinal for the church. But Mormons don't believe in the Trinity. Neither do Jehovah's Witnesses. And so sometimes you'll hear people say, well, they're not Christian. And that might hurt some people's feelings because they'll say, well, that's saying that I'm not a Christian and I believe in Christ just like anybody else. But you have to understand it from their point of view as well. You don't fit the definition of what they believe Christianity is, which is somebody who believes in the Nicene Creeds, in the Trinity. And if that's the definition, they really don't. But again, like I said, groups like the LDS Church are going to be very weird because they'll be doing things that are very different. For instance, they will be practicing polygamy, having more than one wife. They're not monogamous. They'll have polygamous relationships. Not everyone, and it'll be ordered, and we want to be fair to everybody. But like, it is a weird thing, and the idea that just because it was back then was acceptable. In fact, no, it was probably more abhorrent than would be today. That was just not acceptable, and so people really didn't like this. Probably the most controversial issue within that church. They'll also live in communities away from everyone else, almost kind of like the Amish. But the thing that scares people is they come in and sometimes they had attitudes. They'll move into somewhere like Missouri and they'll say, this is God's land and we're going to build it up and we're going to bring all of our members here and it's going to be amazing. And then you'll have these local people, right? You think about it. If you're from Idaho and all these Californians or other people move into the state, it's not that you're not welcoming, but you are nervous about people moving in and changing the way things have been done, right? Well, it's the same thing in Missouri. You have all these people who live there for a really long time, and then you have this new group who doesn't really come and become a part of your community. They create their own community. And not that they kind of live separately, but the way they talk makes it sound like they're saying this is now their stuff. And so that would make you really nervous. The other thing is they are very successful as groups. They'll form these cities very quickly. They will be very industrious, and groups get really scared of this because they really at first think, oh, okay, it's just a couple people, whatever, and they're kind of weird, whatever. But all of a sudden you start seeing these huge thriving cities. In fact, one of the early Mormon cities, Nauvoo, will actually be at one point in time the biggest city in the country. It'll be bigger than Philadelphia. And so that tells you how big these groups were, and it scared people to some degree. Which leads people, when people are afraid of things, it often creates tension and controversy, and eventually even can lead to violence. And so the Mormons are going to get chased out of every state they start in, from New York to Vermont to Ohio to Illinois to Missouri, and eventually out to Utah. And what's really important is that you look and realize that whatever you believe, you have to determine, do you think what the actions of people are okay or not? The leaders of the LDS Church oftentimes got tarred and feathered. When we're talking about tarring somebody and feathering them, you might think of it as like a joke or something like that, or something that is like, mean, but whatever. But you have to remember, tar would be hot. It'd be poured on somebody. And then to get that tar off is not just so easy. You don't just pull it off. It would rip skin. It would cut skin. And it would be humiliating as they added feathers. In fact, Joseph Smith lost several of his children based on these kind of persecutions. People breaking into his home, his children trying to sleep, and not directly, none of his children directly are killed by these mobs, but they will be hurt. And I think it's important that we realize that when people are different than us, is it okay to act this way? And it's important for every group to look at that. Groups today to look at that and make sure they're not doing it to other people. Because sometimes groups, this happens to them, and then they in turn do it to other people. And we don't want that to happen. One of the most famous things that happens is in Missouri, the Governor Boggs, he actually created what was called an extermination order. Here it is right here. And this order said that the Mormons must be driven from the state by any means necessary, which was essentially stating, even if we have to kill these people to get them out, that's fine. Now, the LDS Church is the only religious organization in the United States to actually have an extermination order put on their place. That's pretty intense. Only group to have had that happen. But I do want to put things in context, because sometimes LDS people may not really know all the rest of the history as well in this. So, for instance, Governor Boggs used this language, extermination order, because he had heard one of the early church founders also use language like this in their words. Now, that doesn't justify what Governor Boggs did, but it helps you understand why he did what he did. And we want to be fair. We want to look at things equally. We don't want to be biased in any of these things. Nonetheless, whatever happened, Mormons will be driven from Missouri, and they will leave, and they will go to a place called Winter's Quarter, and eventually they'll leave to go to Utah. Now, Joseph Smith will go to prison in Liberty Jail, where he will be shot by a mob, and he'll fall out the window and die on top of a water well as he falls to the ground. And this is really important. As the founder of Joseph Smith, the founder of the LDS Church, died, the mob and the people at that time believed with him would go to the church. But what they didn't realize is that the next leader of the church, Brigham Young, they call him the Lion of the Lord sometimes, because he was a very loud and very booming figure. In fact, he doesn't get along with some of the early U.S. leaders. In fact, Abraham Lincoln one time said, tell Brigham Young to leave. If he'll leave me alone, I'll leave him alone. They really, Brigham Young was just a very radical figure, and he'll move his people from Winter's Quarters out to Utah to, in their mind, escape this persecution. You have to remember now, Utah is not a part of the country yet. It's actually part of the Mexican territory. And Brigham Young is intense. He goes out there and he says, this is Utah. This is where we're going to build our state. And his state is ginormous. It covers parts of Idaho, Utah, Oregon, California, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. I mean, it covers up a huge chunk of the West. And what's kind of funny about this is that really he didn't have any grounds to do this. This was Mexico's territory. It wasn't U.S. territory. It wasn't like land that he just bought. It was, land he just came upon. And it was ginormous. But he will help settle the West, and there's no doubt about it. The LDS Church is one of the main reasons that the West in Utah becomes such a thriving area in this place, including the city Salt Lake City, which will be a huge stop on the way to California, especially during the gold rush. And so we can see that this is a huge movement in this time period. And the Mormons will do very well under Brigham Young. They will build up a new city, Salt Lake City, and many others around there. And chances are actually that many of the cities that you live in, or if you go to in the West, chances are that Mormons probably were the ones that settled it first. But the Mormons are not the only ones to get a lot of persecution at this time period. Catholics faced incredible discrimination. Protestants were incredibly vicious to Catholics. A lot of times it was because they felt like Catholicism was not compatible or not complementary to democracy. Let me tell you why. This word here, for instance, really describes it really well. Down with popery. You might know, if you are familiar with the Catholic Church at all, that their leader is the Pope. And when he says something, he speaks for the entire Catholic Church, and it's done. When he says something, it's done. That's the decision. That's pretty anti-democracy. If you think about it, democracy, we vote, we have opinions, we talk, we argue, we vote, and that's what happens. The majority wins. Not that way in Catholicism. And so some people are going to say, this is not okay. Catholics are not going to be like us. They're very anti-democracy, so we don't like that. In fact, Catholics will have a pretty hard time getting anywhere in public office for a long time in American history. In fact, if you look at it, we've had, I believe, only one president, John F. Kennedy, to have ever been Catholic, and he was in the 60s. And so you can see that it took a long time for the Catholics to get a following there. And so Catholics will face severe persecution. But they're not the only ones. And many of these people are going to be from other countries like Ireland or Italy, very Catholic-centered areas. And they'll move in clusters of Catholics. And so again, one thing I always like to tell students to do is rather than look and say what something appears as being the issue, I really like to challenge people to look a little bit deeper. So you might be tempted to say, oh, they hated Catholics because Catholics were different than them and they hated their religion, and religion just does this always. But I think you got to look at a deeper issue here. Look at this. Many people from Ireland, these immigrants that were moving in, would work for lower wages. Which means what for Americans? Well, it means that they're going to have competition in getting a job at a factory. And so who do you blame if you're not getting a job at a factory? Well, the guy who took your job. Who took your job? An Irish guy. And so you'll see that there will be a lot of persecution towards Irish people, Italians, and these people are going to be looking to blame them. And what are they going to blame them with? Their religion, Catholicism. So again, sometimes the main issue is not really the real issue here. Another group that will face and has continually faced persecution is going to be the Jews. They will actually be barred in most places, in most states, from holding office. Meaning, like, if you're a Jew, you can't be a governor, a mayor, you can't be anything. That's crazy when you think about the United States and our First Amendment right. It's just crazy, mind-blowing to me that could happen. And the reason that Christians have been so bad towards Jews before is that Christians, again, I think that I'll tell you what they say, but again, we want to look at the more underlying issue. Christians will say that Jews committed deicide. They killed Jesus Christ, God. They killed God. And they'll feel like they're justified in their persecution towards Jews because they did that. Now, that's what they say. But what's the underlying thing? And what we find again is that Jews will work for lower money, that Jews have a very different culture, way of doing things, eating, talking, working, living habits. But also Jews were primarily in banking. And so the Jews that did have work in banking were usually quite a bit better off than other people. They could determine if you got a loan or not. And so if you don't get a loan because of a bank, you might be tempted to say it's because the Jews are horrible, evil people, when in reality you're just mad because you didn't get a loan. I like this picture here. Here is the Pope, Pope Francis, the Catholic Church, and I don't know who this Jewish man is. He's an Orthodox Jew with his black hat and his black shirt or coat here, and they are actually at the Wailing Wall, which is in Jerusalem. This wall up above it would have had the temple originally there that the Romans destroyed and threw down, and this would be them coming together to pray, to show unity between these two faiths. But again, we're talking about religion, but they're not the only reform movements of this time. There's also going to be a heavy utopian ideology at this time. Now, a utopia is a state of thing or place where everything is perfect. So if somebody says, "Oh, isn't this just a utopia?" What they're saying is isn't this just a perfect place that we live? Nothing could be better. Everything's perfect. This idea actually is really pretty old. It comes from a guy named Sir Thomas More, who was a man who helped Henry VIII, who lived in England in the 16th century, and he'll be writing a book called The City of God, which this utopian idea comes from. But there will be many people in the United States who actually believe they can do it. And so they're going to start to build up utopian communities. In fact, Latter-day Saints were one of these groups. They were a utopian society. They're building Zion, a perfect city for God. But they're not the only ones. And those ones, LDS, were religious. This is non-religious so much. So many people are going to separate themselves from the rest of society to try to reach a perfect society. They'll look at the places they live and they'll say something went wrong. Everyone's fighting. Everything's bad. And they'll say, let's split off and make our own religion. Or not religion, I'm sorry, own city. There's one, for instance, called New Harmony in Indiana, founded by a guy named Robert Owen in 1825. He's going to be a social reformer, and it's only going to last for 2 years. And it only had 1,000 followers. And there's a lot of reasons why. Many of these had some very radical beliefs about marriage, about bearing children, about what you could eat. And so sometimes these might seem at first appealing. People will really be drawn at first. But as they start to actually live the lifestyle, they don't really like it so much. Another one was called Brook Farm, and this was near Boston. When we go on American Heritage, you'll actually go to Brook Farm area. And they would build society, and they had these centers to build up together the physical and mental abilities together. And they had 8 followers originally. Now, here is, if you're a big reader, and you like Little Women, you might recognize this house. This is Louisa May Alcott's home, her family's home, I should say. And other famous people have stayed nearby or even in this home for a while. For instance, Nathaniel Hawthorne. So Louisa May Alcott was living in this area. She was part of this utopian society, trying to build a perfect place that they could live in perfect harmony. And then Nathaniel Hawthorne actually came as a skeptic. He came to live to kind of see what life was like, and he eventually will be kind of pessimistic and even he'll be pretty rude towards some of these groups, and he'll even write a book about it. You might be familiar with the book he writes about his actions and what he sees. He'll write the Scarlet Letter, which is about these ultra utopian societies being very judgmental and having pretty bad standards. Another group is going to be the Shakers. The Shakers, actually, his full name is the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. It's a long name, aka the Shakers. Okay, so their faith started actually in the mid-1700s. It's a pretty old faith, but it's going to peak during this time period. And they called them shaking Quakers. The reason being is that they'd have dancing, and when the Spirit was brought upon them, they'd really get moving. Their leader was a woman named Mother Ann Lee, and they actually believed that she was the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the female incarnation. What that means is that Jesus Christ, the Spirit of Jesus Christ, came back into a body, this time in female form, and that woman was Mother Ann Lee. They had several small utopian communities, and they had some pretty radical beliefs. For instance, men and women completely lived in separate homes. You could see the men on this side, the women on this side. They interacted as least as possible. There was no getting married or having any children, no sexual relations at all. So you might ask, how did the church or this group grow? Well, their only way to actually bring converts was to take in orphans or missionary work. And they weren't really big on missionary work, so they took in orphans and raised them. They are still famous this day for their quality goods that they made. They're kind of seen like the Amish. When you say, oh, this is an Amish piece of furniture, you might think, oh, that must be really nice, because the Amish make very high quality stuff. The Shakers do as well, and they were known for that as well. Again, they were called Shakers because in their meetings, they would start when they felt the Spirit shaking. It was the Spirit on their physical manifestation of their body. Today, I think there's 4 members, maybe less, There's not very many Shakers to this day, and that's because, again, they only grow by orphans, and they don't take any orphans hardly, and each of them dies, and then that goes the membership. So the Shakers are going to be a very successful group at first, but will eventually lose a lot of their power, especially as people have to come to grips about living the way that the Shakers are asking them to live. So let's talk about one of my favorite groups here, the Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists are a group that really believes in taking away the structure of religion, the structure of the creeds. And a lot of this is because the Transcendentalists, or many of these early Transcendentalists, will have come from the Unitarian movement. Now, what is a Transcendentalist? I just looked it up. There are only 2 Shakers left on Earth today. So, slowly dying. But anyway, Transcendentalists believe that they could understand life and their purpose of life through God and nature. Forget the creeds, forget a building, forget going to church, and any of those kind of things. Where did you need to go for answers? Where did you need to go for truth? Nature. Go out and be in nature. They believe that the word transcendentalist comes from the word transcend. They believe they could go past the physical dimension of reality into a spiritual dimension if they were just left on their own and able to be in the wilderness, in nature. Probably one of the most famous members is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson is an amazing American. Number one, his former his grandfather was a Unitarian minister, and that's why I'm saying there's a big connection, I think, between the Unitarians and Transcendentalists, at least through Ralph Waldo Emerson, because again, the Unitarians aren't going to believe in these creeds, and they're not going to believe in so much structure like a lot of these early Protestant churches. They would meet oftentimes just to discuss how to make their societies and life better. And they oftentimes would meet in either someone's home. They would take turns. They would also sometimes go out in the woods and just meet. But they didn't really usually have buildings. And they did have a magazine that they edited things in called The Dial. And this was edited by Margaret Fuller, who was the kind of the editor of The Dial. And they were incredibly intellectual, came from some of the better schools, great writers. If you're familiar with writing and great American, if you were to say who are some of the greatest American writers of all time, Ralph Waldo Emerson would definitely be on that list. He's a great poet. He's a great essayist. He's written a lot of great stuff. Well, somebody else like him, who's a transcendentalist, was Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau was an incredibly important figure in American history. In 1846, he was put in jail because he believed that the Mexican-American War was illegal. He believed it was unfair. You'll remember from Unit 1, talking about the Mexican-American War, the United States really had a pretty good controversy of actually taking land from Mexico. In fact, it was pretty much just stolen, right? And he's going to say, this is not okay. But what can he do? He's just one person. So he decides he's not going to pay his taxes. He says, if I pay my taxes, I'll be supporting the war. I don't believe in the war, therefore I won't pay taxes. He'll actually be put in jail. And they say, you're going to stay in jail until you pay your taxes. Ralph Waldo Emerson will actually, his good friend, will bail him out. But he'll have this viewpoint. And he'll write an essay called Civil Disobedience. Now, some of the greatest revolutionary figures in American history and in global history, like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, got their viewpoints from Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau's big thing is, don't be violent. Don't go out and hurt people. Don't kill people. But break the law. Be annoying. So he's going to say, I won't pay my taxes. I'm not hurting anybody, but I'm being annoying. And it's getting my cause out there. This might sound familiar. If you think about Martin Luther King, don't hurt anybody. Don't punch back. But don't move bus seats. When somebody asks you to move your bus seat, don't do it. When somebody says go into that side of the restaurant where there's only colored people, don't do it. So you're not hurting anybody, but you're being annoying. You're breaking the societal norms. Okay? And they're going to get their ideas. Martin Luther King and Gandhi, they get all of their ideas from Henry David Thoreau, this great American transcendentalist. When we got on American Heritage, I'll show you his grave. His biggest thing is that in life, you have to, when you live your life, there's only one thing that you're going to be accountable for. There's only one thing that you're going to care about. When you look back on your life, were you loyal to your conscience? Were you loyal to what you believed? And he says, if you can believe and be loyal to your belief, you'll die a happy person. But if you look back and say, I did things that I don't believe in because that's what society wanted, that's what my family wanted, that's what other people wanted, he says you'll be a very unhappy person. And like I said, this will inspire many leaders like Martin Luther King and Gandhi. If you look over here, this is a picture when I was in Boston, nearby. There is a little cabin that sits near called Walden's Pond. Walden's Pond was owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson, very wealthy family. It's a really nice pond. It's kind of a small lake, really. And people go swimming there all the time. In fact, I have some family that told me they went skinny dipping one time in there, which I don't suggest. You can get arrested for that, for sure. But anyway, Ralph Waldo Emerson is going to ask, or Henry David Thoreau is going to ask his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson to allow him to go and live in nature more, apart from society. And Ralph Waldo Emerson has no problems with this. So Henry David Thoreau builds this teeny tiny one-room cabin, and he'll live there for 2 years. Now, don't think of him as a hermit. He does not, it's not that he has no contact with the city or human nature. He'll go to the tavern and have a drink with people at night. He will do things with people and visit with them and talk to them. But he'll spend most of his time in nature, alone, away from other people, writing, thinking, right, and writing different books. And his book he'll actually write will be called Walden's Pond. And it's a great American classic piece of literature. It's a fantastic book. Most people have it on their books to read before you die. And this is not the real cabin. The real cabin was destroyed, has never been rebuilt. But this is its cornerstones right here. So these are the little foundation stones right here. It's typical for people who go and are transcendentalists to put rocks on top of each other. It stands for nature, and balance represents Thoreau. And here you can see Walden's Pond right here. Okay, a really kind of cool thing, and it demonstrates again this transcendentalist movement. Okay, and so that's it for our notes. But let's just make sure that we have taken all of our objectives have been answered. So how did preachers get trained? Well, they went to school formally. In fact, they could go to Yale or Cincinnati, but they'd get a degree somehow in theology, which would make them an evangelist. What problems exist between the religion and government? Well, lots of them. But the one that we talked about mostly was the Sabbatarians, okay, their belief there. And really, we could go into talking about some of like the Mormons and stuff like that, like them practicing more than one wife. But I think if you just put the Sabbatarians, that would be just fine. What are the different faiths that were that formed at this time? There's many. So there was the AME, I think was the first church we talked about. So that's the first answer. There was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There was the Unitarians. There was the Shakers. And the Transcendentalists. So those are the ones I would expect to have the answers to Objective 3 on. Then Objective 4, what groups face persecution because of their faith? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints did. And the Catholics and the Jews. Those three are the big ones that we talked about. There's many, many more out there, by the way. We just talked about those three. And then the last objective, what groups were not religious but still were reform movements? And those were towards the very end here. These utopian communities, right? We didn't have you write this, but the New Harmony, Indiana ones, Brook Farm. But the one I really want you to remember the most is the Transcendentalists. Transcendentalists are not religious. They are spiritual, but they're not religious. Okay? And so those are the answers to our objectives there. I hope In the Second Great Awakening, you realize and ponder on what did some of these groups do that made them successful versus what did other groups do that made them less successful. Why did some survive and still to this day thrive while others really didn't do well at all? And this is only one, this is the religious aspect of reforming in America. We'll talk about in the future the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and we'll talk about their successes and shortfalls. But we really want to look at today, if you have a movement that you care about, you should be passionate about that, but you should also understand how to advance your cause, especially in today's time period in the United States where things are so divisive. How can we advance our cause? Thanks.